I still remember the night my world collapsed. My father was lying in his bed, breathless, his body lifeless. The official word was that he died of a heart attack, and for a man with a history of heart disease, it was believable. That's what the doctor said. That's what the neighbors whispered. But deep down in my gut, I knew the truth. He hadn't just died. He had been killed. My father was strong despite his condition. He was careful with his health, disciplined, and proud of it. That night, there were people in our house who didn't belong, people who carried greed in their hearts and venom in their words. They wanted what my father had built, and they knew as long as he was alive, they could never touch it. So, they did what cowards always do. They chose the dark path. They silenced him and disguised it as nature taking its course. When I rushed to the hospital, the news was already spreading. Heart attack, they said, as if it were just another statistic, another old man gone too soon. But when I looked at his face, when I saw the faint bruises on his arm, when I noticed the irregular way his shirt had been buttoned and the hurried attempts to cover it up, I knew. They staged it. They murdered my father and thought no one would question it. I filed a case. I stood in front of the police, trembling with grief but burning with rage, and told them everything. I laid out the reasons, the suspects, the circumstances. But what I didn't know then was how deep corruption had already wrapped its claws around our system. The police smiled at me, nodded at me, even patted me on the shoulder like I was a child crying over spilled milk. But when the time came, they said there wasn't enough evidence. They said heart patients die of heart attacks all the time. They said I was blinded by grief, imagining things. It wasn't just incompetence. It was influence. My father's enemies had power, political connections, money flowing in and out of pockets, drinks shared with officers who were supposed to protect people like us. By the time the case reached the court, I wasn't just fighting them. I was fighting a whole machine built to protect them. Their lawyers twisted every word, every memory, every tear. They made me look like a bitter son, unable to accept the reality of a sick father's death. The judge ruled in their favor. Case dismissed. Just like that. I walked out of that courtroom with nothing but the weight of betrayal on my shoulders. They had killed my father, erased the evidence, and walked free in broad daylight. But as I stepped outside, as the sun burned down on my face, a new fire lit up inside me. If justice wasn't going to come from the system, it would come from me. If the law was blind, then I would open its eyes in my own way. Revenge wasn't just an option anymore. It was the only language left to speak. That day, I stopped being the grieving son. That day, I became something else. Something sharper. Something unyielding. They thought they won. They thought the story ended in that courtroom. But they didn't know me. This was just the beginning. The days after the trial were some of the darkest of my life. Every time I stepped outside, I saw them, those who murdered my father, smiling, laughing, living as if nothing had happened. Their cars shined under the sun, their businesses thrived, and their pockets swelled with money stolen not only from us but from countless others. People respected them out of fear, bowed their heads when they passed by. And me? I was invisible, a grieving son with no power, no voice, no justice. At night I couldn't sleep. My father's face haunted me, his last moments replaying in my mind like a broken film reel. I remembered his advice, his lessons, his warnings. Sam, he used, to say the truth always wins, but it may take longer than you expect. That voice kept me alive, but it also cut me apart. Because in those moments, truth felt defeated. I worked meaningless jobs to survive. I swept floors, carried bricks, delivered goods. Every coin I earned felt heavy, not because of its weight, but because of the humiliation I carried with it. The same men who destroyed my father's life would sometimes cross my path. They would smirk, whisper, and sometimes even speak loudly enough for me to hear, mocking me, reminding me that I had lost. Each word pierced like a dagger, but instead of bleeding, I hardened. I started observing them. Where they went, who they met, how they moved. I kept notes, sometimes scribbling them on scraps of paper, sometimes carving them into the back of my mind. I wasn't ready yet, but I knew I would be one day. Patience became my weapon. I worked, I saved, I learned. I read about law, about business, about power. If they had used their influence against me, I would build my own. Years passed. I was no longer the broken young man walking out of the courtroom. I had scars inside me, yes. But I had also grown sharper, stronger. I built connections of my own. Quietly. Carefully. Every betrayal they had thrown at me, every humiliation they had fed me, became the bricks of the foundation I was laying. They thought I had disappeared into the crowd, another forgotten victim. But I was preparing, waiting for the right moment when the hunter would become the prey. And then, the cracks in their empire began to show. Their greed, the very weapon they had used to climb so high, began to turn against them. I saw opportunities, tiny, fragile chances to strike back. One mistake from them, one opening, and I would step in. My father had been taken from me, the courts had denied me, the police had mocked me. But revenge is a long game, and I was finally ready to play. It started small, almost invisible to anyone, watching. I never believed revenge should be rushed. I had waited years, what were a few more months. My enemies, those men who killed my father, had grown careless with time. They believed they were untouchable. Their arrogance was my opportunity. I discovered that their businesses, though powerful, were rotting from the inside. Corruption, unpaid debts, secret deals, all hidden behind layers of lies. I had contacts now, people who owed me favors, men who respected my silence and persistence. With their help, I began to pull the strings quietly, like a shadow whispering through the cracks of their empire. I leaked documents to rivals. I passed information to the authorities they hadn't bribed yet. I even manipulated their own allies, against them. One by one, the walls they had built began to crumble. But revenge isn't only about money or power. It's about pain, the same pain they inflicted on me. I wanted them to feel the weight of betrayal, the sting of fear, the loneliness of standing in a crowd and realizing no one was truly on your side. I remember the night when I first saw fear in their eyes. One of them, the boldest of the group, was forced to sell his mansion. His empire had cracked under the pressure of debts and investigations. He stood in front of the very people who once respected him, begging for mercy, begging for time. His wife left him, his children turned their backs. I stood in that crowd, watching silently. He didn't know I was there, but I knew. And in that moment, my father's voice echoed in me again. Truth always wins, Sam. One by one, the others followed. Their businesses collapsed, their friends abandoned them, their influence faded like dust in the wind. They were no longer kings. They were beggars fighting for scraps in the same streets where they once ruled. And I, the son they had once mocked, stood tall. But my revenge wasn't finished. No, it couldn't end with their downfall. It had to end with me confronting them, face to face, so they would know exactly why their world had burned to ashes. The chance came sooner than I expected. One evening, I walked through the city's old bus station. There, under the dim lights, sitting on the cold cement floor, was one of them. His clothes were ragged, his hair unkempt, his eyes hollow with defeat. He stretched out his trembling hands, begging for coins from strangers who passed him without a glance. For a moment, I just stood there, staring. This was the same man who once laughed at me in court, who once celebrated after my father's death. I walked closer, slowly, letting my footsteps echo. When he looked up at me, our eyes met. Recognition flashed in his gaze, followed by shame, then fear. He whispered my name, barely audible, as if it burned his throat. And I leaned down close enough for only him to hear and said, "This is for my father." I dropped a single coin in his hand. Not out of pity, but as a mark of victory. Because, in that moment, he knew. He knew that everything he had lost, every shred of dignity stripped from him, was the result of the son he had once underestimated. And I knew my revenge was complete. I stood there looking at the man who once held power over life and death, reduced now to a shadow of himself. His hands shook, his lips quivered, his eyes searched mine for mercy. But I felt no pity, only a strange, heavy silence inside my chest. Revenge had been my fire for so many years. And now, standing over his broken body, I realized something. I had become the storm that destroyed him. I turned away, leaving him with his coin and his shame. That night I walked home under the streetlights, the city buzzing around me. For the first time in years I felt free. Not because he suffered, but because I had carried out the justice my father never received. But freedom comes with questions. Did I really win? Or had I simply replaced one form of suffering with another? For nights I lay awake, hearing my father's voice in my dreams. He never wanted me to be consumed by hate. He wanted me to live. And yet revenge had been my only fuel, my only reason to survive. Now that it was done, I stood at a crossroads. One morning as the sun rose, I visited my father's grave. The air was cool, the grass wet with dew. I placed fresh flowers on the stone, kneeling quietly. My heart was heavy, but lighter than it had ever been. "Father," I whispered, "they paid. Not with their blood, but with their pride. They live now as beggars, abandoned, forgotten. That is their punishment." I thought this would heal me. But I realize healing doesn't come from watching others fall. Healing comes from building my own life, stronger than the one they tried to destroy. I stayed there for hours, speaking to him, telling him everything I had carried for years. By the time I rose, I knew what I had to do. I didn't want to be remembered as a man who lived only for revenge. I wanted to be remembered as a man who turned pain into power, suffering into strength. I wanted to carry my father's legacy, not just his wounds. So I built my future. Slowly, patiently, I created something for myself. An honest life, a family that loved me, a home filled with peace. My enemies still lived, broken and forgotten, but I no longer cared. They were no longer part of my story. The real revenge was not their downfall. The real revenge was me rising while they crumbled. And so I leave you with this. If life pushes you into darkness, don't just dream of revenge. Dream of survival. Dream of growth. Because the greatest punishment you can give to those who tried to destroy you is to become everything they could never be. This was my revenge, my justice, my freedom. I am Sam. And this is the story of how I turned pain into power.